Hello and welcome to Unit 2, Cognition. In this unit, we are going to be talking about perception, thinking and problem solving, memory, and intelligence. So in Unit 1, we looked at the biological aspects of behavior. So all of the physical structures inside of our body that allow us to behave a certain way. In this unit, we're going to be looking at what's happening inside of those physical structures. So what's happening inside of our brain, how we are processing this information and making sense of our world around us. So to start, we are going to talk about perception. And perception is the continuation of our last section in our bio unit, sensation. By the end of this video, you should be able to answer the following questions. How do internal and external factors influence perception? And how does our interpretation of the information we receive from the environment influence our behavior and mental processes? So let's go back again to Unit 1 when we talked about sensation. Remember, sensation is the physical information coming into our body. Perception then is our processing of that sensory information. And there are two different types of sensory processing we're going to talk about. The first is called bottom-up processing. Bottom-up processing is data-driven. This is focusing solely on the sensory information coming into our body. This is taking place in real time. For example, when you are first learning to drive, this is a new behavior that you need to do. You have to break apart and analyze all of the different steps to driving. This takes time and requires you to really focus your attention on those different sensory pieces of information. Top-down processing, on the other hand, is when you are using the context of the situation, you're using your past experiences and expectations to make sense of the world. For example, if you're seeing a chair that you've stubbed your toe on before, you're going to avoid that chair in order to prevent that from happening again. In addition, if you're searching for a friend in a crowded room, your internal goal of finding that friend and your past experience with that friend will drive your attention to faces and clothing similar to what your friend usually wears. This is using our past experience and your expectations in order to make sense of a situation. The rest of the video is really going to be talking about different examples of top-down processing that we use to make sense of the world. So some examples we're going to give are attention and selective attention, perceptual set, context effects, perceptual constancies, schema, and gestalt psychology. And we are going to talk about these separately from one another as we go through this video. The first one we're going to talk about is a perceptual set. And a perceptual set is our mental predisposition to perceive one thing and not another. This is our tendency to perceive or notice some aspects of the available sensory data and ignore others. So, for example, if you are really hungry, you are probably more likely to notice food-related stimuli in your environment than someone who is not hungry, because you are predisposed to seeing that food. You're hungry, your body is ready for the food, and so you're going to pay attention to the food. The next principle of perception we're going to talk about are context effects. Context effects are the influence of our environment on how a person perceives and interprets stimuli. For example, in letter A, the blue circles are identical in shape. However, the second one looks larger because of the smaller circles around it. In letter B, we might see that each line is a perfect rectangle, but in the middle of the line, they seem to become more narrow just because of the information that we have around it. In letter C, we're showing how context influences how you recognize objects. So the middle letters in each of these words are identical. The shape is identical, but the surrounding letters make you recognize the shape as either an H or an A based on the information that is surrounding it. And then finally, context can influence how we recognize emotion. In letter D, you just see the face itself. And this face alone of Serena Williams might seem to convey anger. However, when you see the context of the situation, You clearly see that she is happy, excited, triumphant because she just won a match. This is an example of how context can influence our perception of different ideas. The next principle of perception we are going to talk about are perceptual constancies. And this is our ability to perceive objects as remaining the same even when the sensory information that comes in changes. So a reminder, sensory information is external information coming into our body. Light waves, sound waves, food molecules, or odorants. And this information constantly changes. If you just stand in a different location in the room, the light waves that are coming in will be different. And so you're going to actually sense different information. But our brain knows that our world is fairly constant. So the shape of this door, for example, in this image stays the same, even though the sensory information, the light waves that are coming in have changed and you are getting a different shape of that door. But our brain perceives it as the same shape, just changing our angle of seeing that shape. The same goes for color and size. We recognize that color and size stay the same, even though the actual sensory information coming into our body might change based on reflections or shadows. The next principle of perception we're going to talk about is schema, and we're going to talk about schema more in depth in our next video. However, just to give you an idea, schema are the characteristics of concepts that help us organize and interpret unfamiliar information. I like to think of schema as like mental file folders. These are our pieces of information that we have in our brain about a particular concept. For example, you can pull a file folder about a dog out of your brain, and this will have all of the things you know about dogs. They have 4 legs, they have a tail, they are furry, they bark. All of these characteristics make up our schema of a dog. As we are growing and experiencing more things throughout our life, our schema grow and change. And these schema we use to make sense of new pieces of information coming into our body. So for example, if I see an animal that I have never seen before, I might pull out that schema of a dog, pull out the file folder, and compare the new animal to the characteristics I know about the dog. Does it have 4 legs? Yes. Does it have a tail? Yes. Does it have fur? Yes. Does it bark? No. This one is meowing. Therefore, I know it's not a dog. I need to put that in a different file folder. So our schema help us make sense of new information coming in. The next principle of perception we're going to talk about is Gestalt psychology. And I've talked about this before, but we're going to continue to talk about it. Our brain is lazy. Our brain likes to take shortcuts. And the best example of this with perception is Gestalt psychology. The actual definition of Gestalt psychology is that our brain likes to see the sum of an object rather than its parts. So the sum is greater than its parts. And this is the idea that we are likely to see an entire picture rather than the individual pieces of that picture. The best example of this is looking at a computer screen or a TV screen. The actual image that we see on the screen is actually tiny pixels of information, tiny different boxes of color that when put all together make one image. This idea of one image is the sum of the image, and the individual pixels are the parts. There are different principles of Gestalt psychology that our brain uses all of the time. For example, our brain likes to close objects. We notice the G in Gestalt as a G, even though it is broken in between. Our brain automatically closes that object to make one letter that we are used to. Proximity is grouping things that are close to each other in order to make it less parts. For example, if you come into my classroom, you'll notice that I have 6 pods of desks. You don't necessarily count each desk individually. You see each pod as one object. So even though there are 24 desks in the room, you see 6 pods. This is the idea of proximity. The next principle of Gestalt psychology is continuation. And this is the idea that we notice that objects continue even if it's blocked by another object. So the S in Gestalt has a rod going through it. We know that that rod continues behind the S even though we can't see the entire object itself. The next example is similarity. We group things that are similar to one another to make, again, smaller groups. So we put these T's together because they have the same pattern on them. They are similar to one another, so we can group them together. And finally, figure and ground. Figure and ground is the idea of noticing either the object in front or the ground behind it. So if you notice that the white in the middle of this A is the figure or the object that is on top of the black, then you see a tree. If you think that the black is on top and the white is the background, then you see the A, or the upside down V in this case. All of these different principles of perception we have talked about are examples of top-down processing, using our past experiences with the world in order to make sense of it. But sometimes these past experiences allow us to misinterpret the world or have an incorrect perception of what's happening. The first example of this is selective attention. Again, our brain is lazy. It doesn't want to take in all of the information that it can at once. And so the idea of selective attention is our cognitive ability to focus only on specific stimuli or one piece of information while consciously ignoring other competing stimuli in the environment. For example, behind me in this video, you can see all of this stuff that's happening in my classroom. However, you are focusing only on my face or on my lips as you're watching what I'm saying, because that is the most important piece of information. This is an example of selective attention. A specific example of this is called the cocktail party effect. And this is when we have an ability to focus on one particular sound or conversation in a noisy environment. And then you filter out all of those other competing sounds. For example, if you are at a football game and you hear the players on the field and the announcer talking and the Palms song happening and all of the students talking around you, but you can still focus on what your friend is saying directly next to you. You're in the middle of a conversation. This is an example of the cocktail party effect. You can focus only on that one auditory piece of information and block out all of the other auditory information. This is a specific example of selective attention. One way that this is sometimes misinterpreted is inattentional blindness. This is the phenomenon where someone is failing to notice a visually obvious stimuli because your attention is so focused on something else. So if you are so focused on the TikTok in front of you on your phone, you might not notice your mom walk in and stand in front of you, giving you a dirty look. That's because you're so focused on the one thing that you ignore what's happening around you. This is inattentional blindness. A specific example of inattentional blindness is change blindness. And this is where a person fails to notice a significant change in a visual environment, even when it's obvious. This is usually because your attention is focused elsewhere. This is a really popular psychology concept for talk shows to use. So a person might be the cashier at a store and they're doing the transaction with a customer and they duck down underneath the counter and then come back up wearing a different color shirt. The customer is not going to notice the change in the colored shirt because they're so focused on finishing that transaction. So now that we have talked about different principles of perception, let's actually talk about how we see the world and how we process visual information coming in. We're going to talk about perceptual adaptation and depth perception for how we process the information coming in through our eyes. So perceptual adaptation is our visual ability to adjust to an artificially displaced visual field. This is a really fancy way of saying that our eyes get used to different information. The best example of this is when you get new glasses. You might put those new glasses on and things kind of appear fuzzy or off kilter for a little bit, but eventually your brain gets used to that new information coming in and you'll no longer see it as fuzzy. Another example of this is when your eyes get used to a different amount of light in a room. So if you turn on the lights in the morning and now your eyes kind of have to adjust to that new information coming in, way too much light, and you adjust. At first, you really can't see what's happening around you, and then eventually your eyes get used to it, and so you can perceive the information. This is the idea of perceptual adaptation. Another way that we process visual information is depth perception. And depth perception is our ability to determine how far something is from our eyes, or our ability to determine the 3D nature of a particular object. When we are trying to determine how far something is from us, or trying to determine the depth of something, we use different clues to give us information about depth. The first are monocular cues. Monocular cues, if we break apart that word, the prefix mono means one and ocular means eye. So monocular cues are going to be depth cues that help us judge depth based on only information from one eye. So you could cover an eye and you'd still be able to tell which thing is closer to you based on just that one piece of information. Some examples are shown in this image. The first is interposition. If one object is blocking another object, you know that the object in front is probably closer to you. Relative size. We know because of perceptual constancy that the size of objects stays the same. So if one object is bigger than another object, we determine that that bigger object is closer to us than the smaller object. Some others are cast shadows, shading, the distance to the horizon, texture gradient, which is when things are closer to us, they have more detail, and then linear perspective, which is the all too popular parallel lines that come to a point at the horizon. All of these examples are our ability to determine how close something is to us based on information coming in from one eye. The next types of clues are binocular cues. And again, if we break apart that word, the prefix bi means two and ocular means eyes. So binocular cues are clues from both eyes that allow us to judge the depth of a particular object. The first is convergence, and convergence is how close together our pupils are when we are looking at an object. So you can feel this happening if you put your finger out in front of you and you focus on it and then you bring it closer to your eyes. You will feel that your pupils come in toward the middle of your eyes or toward your nose. This is the idea of convergence. They get closer together. If your eyes or your pupils are converged or very close together, that means the object is very close to you. If the pupils are further apart, that means the object is far away. The next binocular cue is retinal disparity. So we know that information that comes into each eye is separate from one another. So our ability to determine how far something is how different each of those sensory pieces of information that come into each eye or each retina is different from one another. You can kind of test this again by putting your finger out in front of you, covering one particular object. In this case, it's this house, and closing one eye and then opening the other. So you can kind of go back and forth. You'll notice that the information that you get is a slightly different picture. Your finger is in a slightly different place every time you close or open another eye. This is because the two pictures or sensory information coming into your retina are different in your left versus your right eye. The greater the difference between the two images, the closer the object is to you. The smaller difference between the two images, the object will be farther away. Finally, let's talk about how we perceive motion in our world. Apparent motion is actually an optical illusion where a stationary object appears to have moved. Other terms for this are sometimes called stroboscopic motion and the phi phenomenon. Both of these things mean the same thing. And this is the idea of rapidly displaying a series of slightly different still images that appear to be creating continuous movement. This essentially is tricking the brain into perceiving movement where there is none. For example, a flip book. If you ever have created the flip book where you create one small image on each page that is just slightly different, and then you flip it really quickly, this gives you the perception of movement, even though they're stationary pictures. The best example of this is a movie. When movies are shot, they're captured on static slides, and then those slides are played really quickly through a video projector. And these images go so quickly that we perceive motion in those stationary slides. You can also see it happening in this image on the screen right now. The black dot isn't actually moving around the purple dots. It's that these purple dots are disappearing one by one in a circular pattern. And this leads you to believing that there's motion happening inside of this picture.